Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear, modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human researched and written material. So I want you to imagine that you are tasked with what has to be the most impossible public relations nightmare in human history.
Oh, man. Yeah.
Right. You have just murdered your best friend. But, you didn't just murder him quietly. You murdered him in public, right alongside a group of your colleagues in just the most violent, chaotic way imaginable.
And it gets worse because now you have to step out onto a balcony, look out over a crowd of millions of citizens who absolutely adored this guy.
They're probably losing their minds, yeah.
Exactly. And you have to convince them that you did it out of love. You basically have to rebrand a brutal political assassination as an act of profound patriotism.
It's wild. It's this impossible blood-soaked dilemma, and that is actually the center of our deep dive today.
It really is the ultimate test of human rhetoric and rationalization, too. I mean, how do you spin the ultimate betrayal? And I guess more importantly, how do you convince yourself that you are the hero of the story, even while your hands are literally covered in blood?
Yeah, that's the core of it. So today, our mission on this deep dive is to guide you, the listener, through the really complex moral and political landscape of William Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. And I want to be incredibly clear right out of the gate here. This isn't, it's not just a recap of a dusty play about guys in togas giving long speeches.
No, not at all.
What we are looking at is a profound, almost surgical exploration of human ambition. We're looking at the absolute fragility of democratic institutions, the ethics of leadership, and like you said, the incredibly elaborate stories we tell ourselves to justify our most questionable actions.
What's so fascinating here is that we have the full text of the play to draw from, and it serves as this amazing psychological mirror. I mean, Shakespeare wasn't just chronicling a historical event, right? He was dissecting the actual mechanics of power. He's looking at how a republic falls. And it's not just through military force, but through the weaponization of language and the manipulation of public fear and just the blinding nature of personal ego.
I am so excited to unpack this. The timeless human psychology hidden in this text is just incredible. So we're promising you, the listener, a shortcut to understanding its most transformative insights, and we're going to do it without getting bogged down in archaic language.
Yeah, we're going to translate this ancient context into real 21st century realities.
Because when you look closely at the machinations in this text, you're going to see exactly how modern political echo chambers are built. You'll see how information is weaponized to manufacture outrage and how the highest moral ideals can be twisted into absolute tyranny.
It's spooky how relevant it is. But to truly understand the stakes of this deep dive, to understand why these characters are willing to risk absolutely everything, we first have to ground ourselves in the historical and human context.
Yeah, we need to establish the world.
Exactly. Because the fear driving this entire narrative is something profoundly specific to the Roman psyche. We really have to understand the terror of the crown.
Right. Because when we first open the text, Rome is a republic.
Yeah.
And a republic, fundamentally, is a system where power is distributed, right?
Yeah.
But it's not just a political preference for the Romans.
Yeah.
It is their core identity.
Yeah, it's who they are.
And it was born out of intense cultural trauma.
Precisely. If we connect this to the bigger picture, you have to go back centuries before the events of this play. Rome was originally ruled by kings, and it culminated in this dynasty known as the Tarquins.
The Tarquins, right.
Yeah, and these kings became incredibly tyrannical. It culminated in these historical atrocities that deeply, deeply scarred the Roman consciousness. So the people rose up, overthrew the monarchy, and established the Roman Republic. But they didn't just change the government.
They took it a step further.
They swore a literal blood oath. They made it a foundational tenet of what it meant to be Roman, that they would never, ever be ruled by one man again.
It's basically generational trauma, just baked into their constitution. The very idea of a king of one man ruling alone is deeply offensive to them. It is the absolute boogeyman of Roman politics. I mean, if you want to destroy a politician in Rome, you don't call him corrupt. You accuse him of wanting to be a king.
Exactly. The concept of rex, the Latin word for king, was just a poisonous word. The Republic was designed with these incredibly elaborate checks and balances. Specifically, they had 2 consuls who served 1-year terms just to ensure that power never coalesced around a single individual.
Right. Keep it moving. Keep it spread out.
Right. But as we enter the opening scenes of the text, that system is under immense, immense strain. The Republic is fracturing because one man has grown so large, so wealthy, and just so militarily powerful that the system can literally no longer contain him.
Julius Caesar. And, the way the text introduces him is brilliant. Caesar is returning to Rome in an absolute triumph. He's throwing this massive parade. But here is the critical detail, and it's so important. He isn't returning from a foreign war.
No, he is not.
He isn't bringing back gold from conquering Gaul. He is returning from defeating Pompey.
This is a crucial distinction because Pompey was a fellow Roman.
Right.
He was a former ally of Caesar, actually. They were part of the first triumvirate together, and Pompey was a beloved general in his own right.
They fought a brutal civil war. So Caesar's throwing a huge party to celebrate, essentially, the shedding of Roman blood. And immediately we see this massive visceral divide in how the people react to this.
Yeah, the city is split.
On one side, you have the commoners. They are out in the streets taking a holiday, partying. There's this fantastic, cheeky cobbler character who argues with the elites in the street. And he's making these puns about being a mender of bad souls.
Meaning the bottom of a shoe, but obviously implying he's mending their spiritual souls as well.
Exactly. The common people, they just want to celebrate a winner. They don't care about the politics of it.
But then you have the elites. The tribunes, Flavius and Marullus, and they're looking at this celebration with just absolute terror and disgust. Marullus actually delivers this really intense speech shaming the crowd.
Oh, it's a great speech.
He reminds them of how they used to love Pompey. He says, knew you not Pompey? Many a time and oft have you climbed up to walls and battlements to see great Pompey pass the streets of Rome.
It's a beautiful piece of rhetoric. He's painting this really vivid picture of how obsessed the crowd was with Pompey, cheering so loudly that the river Tiber trembled. And then he pivots and basically says, and now you put on your best clothes? Now you throw flowers in the path of the man who murdered him?
The tribunes are terrified of the crowd's fickleness. Because the masses, they do not care about the constitutional crisis. They just care about the spectacle, the parade. But the elites see the writing on the wall. Flavius even compares Caesar to a bird flying too high.
Plucking the feathers, right?
No. Yeah. He says they need to pluck the feathers from Caesar's wing so they can make him fly an ordinary pitch. Because otherwise, he will soar above the view of men and keep us all in servile fearfulness.
They are terrified he's going to declare himself king.
Yeah.
This cultural terror, this historical allergy to kingship that we were talking about, is exactly what the character of Cassius manipulates to start the conspiracy.
Yes, Cassius is a master manipulator.
Because Cassius is a senator and he hates Caesar. But he knows he can't just walk up to his peers and say, hey guys, I'm really jealous of Caesar, let's go stab him.
Right, that wouldn't play well.
No, he has to dress it up in this incredibly noble language of Republican defense.
And Cassius zeroes in on Brutus. Brutus is widely respected, he's immensely honorable, and he's absolutely crucial to any conspiracy because his involvement will legitimize the assassination in the eyes of the public.
The PR factor.
Exactly. When Cassius starts working on Brutus, he performs what is basically a masterclass in psychological manipulation. He doesn't start with constitutional theory, which you might expect. He starts by attacking Caesar's physical body.
Right. This is so interesting to me. Cassius tells Brutus these incredibly intimate, almost petty stories about Caesar. Like he talks about a time they were swimming in the Tiber River on this really cold, windy day.
Yeah, a swimming contest.
Right. Caesar challenged Cassius to a race, but Caesar started drowning. Cassius had to pull him out, and he mocks how Caesar cried out, "Help me, Cassius, or I sink."
He deliberately contrasts the mortal, fragile, physically flawed man with this deity that the public is turning him into.
He's bursting the bubble.
Yeah, and he recounts another time when Caesar was sick with a fever in Spain. Cassius says this supposed god was shaping, his lips were pale, and he groaned for water as a sick girl. Cassius is just deeply, deeply offended by the discrepancy between Caesar's mortal frailty and his monumental political power.
He literally calls him a colossus. He says, Caesar doth bestride the narrow world like a colossus, and we petty men walk under his huge legs and peep about to find ourselves dishonorable graves. He is so furious that a guy who, cries for water when he has a fever is now being treated like the master of the universe.
And this leads to one of the most famous pieces of rhetoric in the entire text. Cassius looks at Brutus and says, "The fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves that we are underlings."
Okay, let's unpack this right here.
Yeah, okay.
Because out of context, that quote is everywhere.
Oh, absolutely everywhere.
People use it as, like, a motivational poster. It sounds like the ultimate take control of your destiny self-help mantra. Don't blame fate, don't blame astrology, don't blame the stars. Take action and fix your life. But when you look at the mechanics of what Cassius is actually doing, isn't he just using this empowering, agentic rhetoric to mask his own petty jealousy?
That is precisely the danger of the rhetoric, and it really highlights a major theme of the text, which is how easily noble language can be weaponized. Cassius is a master of finding the exact psychological lever to move his target. He knows Brutus is deeply tied to his family's legacy. So after pushing the take control of your destiny angle, Cassius explicitly invokes Brutus's ancestors.
Right, because Brutus's ancestor was the guy who overthrew the Tarquin kings centuries ago.
Yes, exactly. Cassius reminds him, saying, "There was a Brutus once that would have brooked the eternal devil to keep his state in Rome as easily as a king." He's basically telling Brutus, your very name means tyrant slayer. How can you sit here and let this man become a king? It is a brilliant, manipulative hijacking of noble heritage.
So Cassius doesn't hate tyranny. He just hates that he isn't the tyrant. He hates the hierarchy. He is totally weaponizing the trauma of the Republic to serve his own envious ends.
It clarifies the core problem the author is addressing in this section. The institutions of a republic are incredibly fragile when bad actors learn how to mimic the language of patriotism. Cassius is essentially radicalizing Brutus.
But, Cassius's manipulation wouldn't work if Brutus didn't have a massive psychological vulnerability of his own. And his vulnerability isn't greed, it isn't ambition, and it isn't envy. Terrifyingly, Brutus's vulnerability is his own morality.
This brings us to the core wisdom of the text, and what we might call the tragedy of honorable intentions. Brutus is the moral center of the play. Unlike Cassius, Brutus has absolutely no personal grievance against Caesar. In fact, Caesar loves him.
They're close friends.
Very close. But Brutus becomes the most dangerous man in Rome precisely because he truly believes he is acting for the general good.
We get this incredible window into Brutus's mind in Act 2, when he is alone in his orchard. He's pacing back and forth in the middle of the night trying to convince himself that murder is the right path. He admits, I know no personal cause to spurn at him, but for the general. He literally acknowledges that Caesar hasn't actually done anything tyrannical yet, but he might.
Brutus relies on a devastatingly flawed piece of logic, the preemptive strike. He compares Caesar to a serpent in an egg. He reasons that if you let a venomous snake hatch, it will become dangerous. Therefore, the only logical, moral thing to do is to kill him in the shell.
It is entirely theoretical. He's condemning a man to death not for crimes committed, but for a psychological projection of what might happen if he gets more power. And Brutus justifies this with the most iconic rationalization in the text. Later, he tells the crowd, not that I love Caesar less, but that I loved Rome more.
He creates a philosophical framework where a brutal assassination becomes a civic duty. And this is his fatal flaw. Because his internal intentions are pure, he believes the entire enterprise is pure. He thinks his noble motives magically cleanse the act of murder.
We see this exact dynamic play out when the conspirators finally meet in secret.
Yeah.
Cassius, being the practical Machiavellian plotter that he is, says, let's swear a secret oath. Let's bind ourselves together so no one backs out. And what does Brutus do?
Brutus shuts him down completely. He delivers this soaring speech rejecting the idea of an oath. He argues that the even virtue of our enterprise is binding enough. He essentially says, only criminals, cowards, and men with bad causes need to swear oaths in the dark. We are honorable Romans doing a noble deed. Our virtue is our bond.
It's an astonishing level of naivete, honestly. He is organizing a literal political assassination in the middle of the night, and he thinks they don't need a pact because everyone is acting from the exact same lofty philosophical place that he is.
His obsession with moral purity completely blinds him to human nature. And we see the mechanics of this philosophical breakdown even more clearly when the conspirators discuss who exactly they're going to kill.
Because it wasn't just going to be Caesar, right?
Well, Cassius, again looking at the practical reality of the situation, points out that Mark Antony is a fiercely loyal supporter of Caesar. Cassius argues that if they leave Antony alive, he will seek revenge and destroy them. Cassius says, let them fall together.
But Brutus refuses. And his reasoning is just chilling in its disconnect from reality. He says they must be sacrificers, but not butchers. He tells the conspirators, let's carve him as a dish fit for the gods, not hew him as a carcass fit for hounds.
He is attempting to aestheticize violence. He believes he can dictate the spiritual nature of a physical stabbing. He tells the men to be purgers, not murderers. He wants to commit an act of extreme violence, but keep his hands spiritually clean.
Here is where I really have to push back on Brutus, or rather, where the text pushes back violently against Brutus's worldview. Brutus genuinely thinks he can manage an assassination like a surgical strike. He thinks you can isolate the act of plunging a dagger into a human body from the messy, emotional, cascading chaos of a political vacuum. But isn't that like trying to control a wildfire with a garden hose?
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
I mean, can you really commit a brutal act of violence and maintain control of the narrative?
The text provides a definitive no. If we break down the mechanics of his failure, the core wisdom here is a devastating critique of idealism divorced from pragmatism. Pure intentions do not guarantee pure outcomes. Brutus's fatal flaw is his belief that his internal moral compass has the power to dictate external reality.
He assumes the Roman public will see the bloody corpse and just immediately recognize the philosophical purity of the act.
Exactly. The text warns us that abstract ideals like liberty, freedom, justice, they rarely survive contact with messy, bloody human reality. Once you introduce violence into a political system as a means of solving a problem, you lose control of it. You cannot unleash a wildfire and then philosophically instruct it on which trees it is permitted to burn.
We see this pattern continually in modern history, too. Think about modern nation-states launching interventions or aggressive campaigns in the name of freedom or human rights. The leaders genuinely believe they possess the moral high ground. They believe it will be a surgical strike.
Yeah, quick in-and-out operation.
Right, but they're completely blind to the chaotic, cascading realities on the ground, and the situation devolves into horrific, uncontrollable warfare. The belief that your good intentions insulate you from the catastrophic consequences of your actions is a lethal blind spot.
And blind spots are arguably the most prominent psychological feature of the text, because while Brutus is blinded by his rigid idealism, Caesar is blinded by something far more common, which is his ego. And this leads us directly to analyzing the obstacles to growth in the text, specifically examining how power creates impenetrable echo chambers.
Caesar is the ultimate case study in how success ruins your ability to perceive reality. Let's really look at why leaders fail to see impending disaster, because the universe is practically screaming at Caesar that he is about to die. Right from the beginning, in that opening parade scene, a soothsayer pushes through the crowd and yells, "Beware the Ides of March."
And Caesar's reaction is incredibly revealing. He stops the procession, he demands that the man be brought before him, he looks him right in the eye, hears the warning again, and then simply dismisses him with a wave of his hand. He says, "He is a dreamer. Let us leave him. Pass."
It's the casual dismissal of uncomfortable data. He has reached a point of such supreme power that he believes he is insulated from the normal rules of the universe. He doesn't even get angry. He just finds the warning beneath his notice.
But the text escalates the warnings dramatically. As we move into Act 2, the night before the assassination, Rome is engulfed in supernatural chaos.
It's like a horror movie.
It really is. The text describes terrible storms, raining fire, a lion walking casually past the Capitol, and an owl hooting in the marketplace at noon. The characters view the natural world as violently rejecting the political reality.
And inside Caesar's house, it's just as chaotic. His wife, Calphurnia, is having horrific nightmares. She literally cries out in her sleep, "Help, ho!"
Yeah.
To murder Caesar. She begs him not to go to the Senate that day.
She describes a terrifying, explicitly predictive dream. She dreamed she saw Caesar's statue spouting blood from 100 different pipes, and smiling Romans came and bathed their hands in the blood. And furthermore, Caesar's own priests, the augurers, they perform a sacrifice and find that the animal has no heart. They strongly advise him to stay home.
It is an absolute barrage of red flags. The data is overwhelmingly negative. And Caesar's arrogance in the face of this is staggering. He delivers this famous soaring piece of rhetoric. Cowards die many times before their deaths. The valiant never taste of death but once.
It sounds heroic, sure, but psychologically it is the ultimate defense mechanism. He is basically saying, "I am Caesar. Fear is for lesser men." He even twists the horrifying omen of the heartless beast to flatter himself.
Oh, this part is crazy.
Yeah, he claims the gods did it to shame cowardice, meaning he would be a beast without a heart if he stayed home out of fear. And notice how he constantly refers to himself in the third person. Caesar shall go forth. He has separated his mortal self from the mythic persona of Caesar.
But even with all that ego, Calphurnia finally breaks him down. She gets on her knees and begs, and he actually relents. He agrees to stay home. And this is where we meet the true obstacle to his survival, Decius.
Decius is one of the conspirators. His specific assigned role in the plot is to manage Caesar's psychology. He is the one tasked with ensuring Caesar physically walks into the trap at the Senate.
And Decius performs an absolute masterclass in predatory psychology. When he arrives and Caesar says, I'm not coming today, tell the Senate it is my will to stay home because my wife had a bad dream, Decius doesn't argue. He doesn't tell Caesar he's being silly. Instead, he completely reinterprets the data.
He takes the exact same terrifying imagery, the statue spouting blood, and flips the narrative. Decius tells Caesar, this dream is all misinterpreted. He claims the blood doesn't signify death. He says it means that great Rome shall suck reviving blood from Caesar. He tells him that great men will press in to get tinctures, stains, relics from him.
He turns a literal nightmare of assassination into a glorious vision of Caesar as the life-giving divine savior of the Republic. He tells Caesar exactly what his ego wants to hear, and then he deploys the ultimate weapon. FOMO. Fear of missing out.
Decius expertly applies political pressure. He casually mentions, by the way, the Senate has concluded to give this day a crown to mighty Caesar. He dangles the ultimate prize, but then he adds the threat. If you shall send them word, you will not come. Their minds may change.
He says, what will people say? They will whisper, lo, Caesar is afraid.
Decius understands the mechanics of Caesar's mind perfectly. Caesar claims he doesn't fear death, but Decius knows Caesar's true fears. He fears looking weak, and he fears losing the crown. Decius uses Caesar's own vanity to blindfold him and walk him right to his execution.
This entire sequence is such a powerful modern translation for how leadership fails today. Think about a CEO, political leader, or even just a manager who surrounds themselves with an echo chamber. You can have the actual data right in front of you. The market is crashing, the polling is abysmal, the supply chain is broken, but the leader only listens to the specific data analyst who spins the bad numbers into a positive projection.
They want the bleeding statue to be interpreted as a sign of massive revenue growth.
Exactly. It's deeply countercultural because we love to tell ourselves that we are rational, data-driven creatures. But our egos are massive cognitive vulnerabilities. We naturally resist warnings that challenge our self-image. If an analyst tells a CEO, your strategy is failing, the CEO gets defensive. But if a consultant comes in and says, this isn't failure, this is a period of disruptive innovation that will ultimately solidify your legacy, the CEO writes them a massive check.
Decius actually brags about this psychological vulnerability earlier in the text. When the conspirators are worried Caesar might not show up, Decius says, but when I tell him he hates flatterers, he says he does, being then most flattered. Caesar's ego is the exact mechanism that destroys him.
We want the Decius in our lives to tell us everything is fine, rather than the Calphurnian who tells us the uncomfortable, terrifying truth. And unfortunately for Caesar, he listens to Decius, he goes to the Capitol, and he is brutally assassinated, bleeding to death at the base of his old rival Pompey statue.
Which creates an immediate, catastrophic power vacuum. The conspiracy has succeeded in the physical act of murder, but now they face the impossible task you mentioned at the beginning of the show. They have to sell this murder to the public.
Which brings us to what might be the most fascinating part of this entire deep dive, the weaponization of information. How does this text challenge the way we consume media, handle public conflict, and relate to the masses today? Let's dive deep into the funeral orations in Act 3.
This sequence is a foundational text for understanding rhetoric, public relations, and mass manipulation. The Roman mob is rioting. They are confused, angry, and demanding answers. Brutus, the moralizing idealist, steps up to the pulpit first to calm them down.
And remember the mechanics of Brutus's worldview. He believes his cause is inherently logical and pure, so he approaches this angry, traumatized mob as if he is presenting a thesis defense at a university. He relies entirely on logos, the appeal to logic.
He structures his speech as a series of rational propositions. He says, if there be any in this assembly, any dear friend of Caesar's, to him I say that Brutus's love to Caesar was no less than his. He establishes his credibility. Then he delivers his core argument. As Caesar loved me, I weep for him. As he was fortunate, I rejoice at it. As he was valiant, I honor him. But as he was ambitious, I slew him.
It is clean, it is balanced, it is perfectly symmetrical rhetoric. He essentially asks the crowd, would you rather Caesar were living and die all slaves than that Caesar were dead to live all free men? He relies on the audience to be rational actors who will weigh his argument, agree with his philosophical premise about ambition, and rationally applaud the assassination.
And the tragic irony is that initially it works. The crowd is swayed, but they don't actually understand the philosophy. They cheer for Brutus, and one of them even shouts, let him be Caesar.
Which is the most devastating punchline in the play. Brutus just murdered his best friend to destroy the concept of Caesar as a dictator. And the crowd's immediate response is, great argument, Brutus. You should be the new dictator. It completely exposes the futility of his logical appeal.
But Brutus is so blinded by his own perceived success that he makes a catastrophic tactical error. He believes his rational argument is so robust, so intellectually bulletproof, that it can withstand any counter-argument. So he leaves the stage. He tells the crowd to stay and listen to Mark Antony deliver a eulogy, and Brutus simply walks away, leaving Antony alone with the mob and Caesar's body.
It is an unfathomable mistake. And this is where Mark Antony steps up and proves himself to be an absolute genius of political warfare. If Brutus delivered a university lecture, Antony delivers an emotional thunderstorm. Antony understands what Brutus does not. Crowds are not moved by logic. They are moved by pathos, emotion.
Antony steps up to the pulpit, and he is facing a hostile crowd. They are actively shouting that Caesar was a tyrant and that Brutus is a hero. So Antony doesn't argue with them directly. He uses a rhetorical technique of brilliant misdirection. He starts with, "Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears. I come to bury Caesar, not to praise him."
He immediately lowers their defenses. He's saying, hey, I'm not here to argue with Brutus. The evil that men do lives after them.
Exactly. He acknowledges Brutus's core premise that Caesar was ambitious, but then he slowly, methodically begins to introduce counter-evidence, bypassing their logic and appealing entirely to their emotions and their memory. And he does this through heavy, escalating irony.
This is the famous repetition. Antony keeps repeating the phrase honorable man. He says, Brutus is an honorable man, so are they all honorable men.
The first time he says it, he sounds completely sincere. The crowd accepts it. But then he starts dropping data points that contradict Brutus's thesis. He reminds the crowd that Caesar brought captives to Rome, whose ransoms filled the public coffers. He asks, did this in Caesar seem ambitious? And then he repeats, but Brutus says he was ambitious, and Brutus is an honorable man.
The second time, there is just a hint of doubt. Then he reminds them that when the poor cried, Caesar wept. He reminds them that at the festival of Lupercal, Antony offered Caesar a kingly crown 3 times, and Caesar refused it 3 times. Was this ambition? Yet Brutus says he was ambitious, and sure, he is an honorable man.
By the 5th and 6th time he repeats the phrase, the word honorable has become toxic. It has become a sarcastic slur. Antony is juxtaposing Brutus's abstract philosophical claim of ambition against the crowd's tangible emotional memories of Caesar's generosity.
Antony is basically reverse engineering a social media algorithm in real time. Brutus posted a long, text-heavy, rational essay that got polite applause. Antony knows that won't drive engagement. So Antony bypasses the brain's logic centers and goes straight for the visual, visceral outrage receptors. He doesn't just talk, he uses props.
Yes, the physical staging of the scene is vital. Antony descends from the pulpit, he leaves the elevated space of authority and goes down to stand on the exact same level as the plebeians. He forms a circle around Caesar's corpse.
And then he holds up Caesar's bloody mantle, his cloak. He makes the political violence devastatingly intimate. He points to the literal holes in the fabric and names the conspirators who made them. He invents the narrative on the spot. He says, look, in this place ran Cassius's dagger through. See what a rent the envious Casca made. Through this, the well-beloved Brutus stabbed.
He describes Brutus's stab as the most unkindest cut of all, claiming that when Caesar saw Brutus stab him, his heart burst from ingratitude before the dagger even killed him. He is painting a picture of profound emotional betrayal, whipping the crowd into a state of intense grief and rage. He shows them the mangled body.
The crowd is absolutely losing it at this point. They're weeping, they're furious, but Antony knows he needs one more push to turn them from a grieving crowd into a destructive weapon. And he deploys his ultimate tool, the clickbait.
The will. Antony uses a rhetorical device called paralipsis, bringing up a subject by pointedly denying that it should be brought up. He pulls out a parchment and says, I found this in Caesar's closet, 'tis his will. But then he immediately says, let but the commons hear this testament, which, pardon me, I do not mean to read.
It is so manipulative. Oh, I have his will right here, but I really shouldn't read it to you. It will just make you too upset to know how much he loved you. You are not wood, you are not stones, you are men, and if you hear this, it will inflame you. He is deliberately manufacturing the outrage.
He creates an unbearable psychological tension. The crowd begs him, they demand that he read the will, and when he finally yields, he reveals that Caesar left every single Roman citizen 75 drachmas, and that he opened his private orchards and gardens as public parks for their pleasure.
He appeals directly to their wallets, and that is the match in the powder barrel. The crowd completely loses their minds. They go from politely cheering Brutus's logic to rioting in the streets. They tear up benches to make a funeral pyre, and they run off to burn the conspirators' houses to the ground. Antony stands back and literally says, mischief, thou art afoot. Take thou what course thou wilt.
This sequence translates so powerfully to our modern reality. It forces us to ask terrifying questions about how we consume information and how our opinions are shaped. Are we making decisions based on rational evaluation, like Brutus naively hoped? Or are we being manipulated by performative empathy, manufactured outrage, and appeals to our personal grievances and economic anxieties?
Antony's playbook is the exact playbook used by modern disinformation campaigns, political extremists, and engagement-driven algorithms. You don't win by engaging with the logic of your opponent's argument. You win by reframing the narrative around emotional betrayal, using visceral imagery, and promising the audience a financial or tribal reward. Antony proves that the person who understands the algorithm of human emotion, who knows how to weaponize grief and greed, is the one who holds the power. Brutus's logic didn't stand a chance.
Which leads us nicely into the section on wisdom with discernment. Because while we can admire Brutus's desire to be logical, we have to critically examine the philosophical operating system he is running on. Brutus is deeply committed to Stoicism. But this text shows us the catastrophic danger of a rigid philosophy when it collides with human reality.
Yes, let's break down the mechanics of his Stoicism. Stoicism, in its ideal form, is about emotional control, prioritizing rational duty over passion, and maintaining absolute moral purity regardless of external circumstances. But as we move into Acts 4 and V, we see how this philosophy makes Brutus a disastrous leader.
The clearest example of this breakdown happens in the famous tent scene in Act 4. Rome has fallen to Antony and Octavius, and Brutus and Cassius have fled to the provinces to raise armies. But the two leaders of the rebellion are at each other's throats.
Brutus is absolutely furious with Cassius because Cassius has been taking bribes. Cassius has been selling political offices for gold to fund their army. Brutus condemns him for having an itching palm. He reminds Cassius of their noble motives, saying, "Did not great Julius bleed for justice' sake?" He argues that they didn't strike down the foremost man of the world just to contaminate their fingers with base bribes.
Brutus is standing on his Stoic principles. He declares that he would rather be a dog and bark at the moon than be a Roman who engages in such corruption. It sounds incredibly noble, but there's a massive cognitive dissonance at play here. In almost the exact same breath that he condemns Cassius for extortion, Brutus attacks him for something else entirely.
This is the hypocrisy that is so fascinating to me. Brutus is furious that Cassius denied his request for gold to pay his legions.
Let's trace the logic there. Brutus says, "I can raise no money by vile means. He is too honorable to wring coins from the hard hands of peasants. But he has a massive army to feed and pay. So he demands that Cassius give him some of the money that Cassius extorted."
Cassius, you are a terrible, corrupt monster for extorting this money. Also, how dare you not give me my half of the extorted money? It is staggering. He wants to keep his hands perfectly clean, but he desperately wants to spend the dirty money to fund his righteous war.
This is the ultimate blind spot of rigid idealism. Brutus wants the practical benefits of corruption without the moral stain. It highlights how principles without pragmatism can become a form of narcissism. Brutus is more concerned with his self-image as an honorable man than he is with the messy reality of winning a war.
This maps so perfectly onto modern geopolitical and corporate ethics. Think about a modern nation-state that prides itself on strict human rights ideals. They want to keep their hands clean. But to maintain their geopolitical power, they fund proxy wars, funneling weapons and money to groups who do the dirty, brutal work on the ground. Or think of a massive corporation that boasts about being carbon neutral and sustainable at its sleek headquarters while completely outsourcing its pollution and labor abuses to unregulated factories overseas. They are playing the exact same game as Brutus. They want the clean conscience, but they demand the gold.
The expert insight here is that Brutus's philosophy makes him incapable of true partnership. He alienates his primary ally in the middle of a desperate war. And we see the toxic, destructive extremes of this Roman virtue culture in his personal life as well, specifically with his wife, Portia.
Portia's storyline is incredibly dark, but it illustrates this point perfectly. Earlier in the play, when Brutus is plotting the assassination and keeping secrets, Portia wants to prove that she is strong enough to handle the truth. And how does she prove it? She literally takes a knife and stabs herself in the thigh, burying the excruciating pain in silence.
She uses self-mutilation as a credential. She says, "I have made strong proof of my constancy, giving myself a voluntary wound here in the thigh. Can I bear that with patience and not my husband's secrets?" It is a horrifying expression of loyalty, but it perfectly reflects the severe expectations of their philosophical culture. To prove her worth, to prove she isn't a weak woman by Roman standards, she must commit an act of extreme, stoic violence against her own body.
And it foreshadows her ultimate end. When things go terribly wrong for the conspirators and Antony seizes power, Portia falls into despair, and she kills herself by swallowing hot coals.
It is a brutal, unyielding standard where any show of normal human vulnerability is seen as a fatal weakness. Brutus's stoicism forces him to suppress his grief over her death. When he is told she died, he just says, "Why, farewell, Portia. We must die, Messala." He refuses to process the emotion, pushing it down to maintain his rigid facade of command.
And that suppression of emotion, that disconnect from reality, leads directly to terrible strategic decisions. Brutus's philosophy demands that he always take the perceived moral high ground, even in military tactics.
Exactly. We must discern from this text that idealism can be a strategic disaster. Cassius, the experienced soldier, wants to keep their army on the high ground at Sardis and let Antony and Octavius exhaust their resources marching to them. It is the smart tactical move, but Brutus overrules him.
Brutus gets caught up in his own poetic rhetoric. He delivers that famous speech, "There is a tide in the affairs of men," which, taken at the flood, leads on to fortune. He essentially says, the universe is on our side right now. We have to march forward to Philippi. He abandons a superior military position because of a theoretical, philosophical vibe, and it seals their doom.
So, synthesizing all of this heavy psychological, political, and historical ground, how do we translate this into the practical how-to? What are the actionable takeaways for a listener navigating their own life, career, and relationships today?
I think we can pull three very distinct, powerful reflections from the mechanics of this text. The first is what we might call evaluate your Decius.
This goes back to how Caesar was manipulated. The practical reflection for the listener is, who interprets the bleeding statues for you?
Yes. When you are leading a project, running a team, or just managing your own life, you are going to encounter bad omens. You are going to get negative feedback, a terrible performance review, or a failed metric. When that happens, who is in your inner circle? Do you have Calphurnia who will look at the terrifying truth and say, "Stop, you are in danger, you need to change course"? Or have you surrounded yourself with Decius figures?
We all have a natural vulnerability to flattery. The question to ask yourself is whether you incentivize people to tell you the hard truth, or if you reward the people who spin your failures into a narrative of misunderstood genius. If your inner circle only ever agrees with you, you are not being supported. You're being insulated from reality.
That is a critical audit to run on your professional life. Okay, what is the second practical reflection?
The second is the Brutus versus Cassius audit, and it applies to how we handle conflict. When you find yourself in a dispute at work or a major argument in your relationship, you need to pause and interrogate your own operating system.
You have to ask yourself, am I acting out of petty resentment and envy, like Cassius? Or am I acting out of a rigid, uncompromising sense of my own moral righteousness, like Brutus? Because the text shows us that both are incredibly destructive.
If you are Cassius, you are letting your jealousy drive you to tear others down, masking your insecurity with aggressive action. But if you are Brutus, you are equally dangerous. You might be using your principles as a weapon to avoid compromise, judging everyone else as morally inferior, and demanding that your partner or colleagues do the dirty work while you keep your hands clean.
You have to audit your motives. Are you actually trying to solve the problem, or are you just trying to prove that you are the most honorable person in the room?
Precisely. And the third practical takeaway centers on cognitive bias and decision-making under extreme pressure. We see this in the tragic climax of the text, at the Battle of Philippi.
Right. The battle is raging, it's chaotic, and Cassius is standing on a hill trying to figure out what is happening. He sends his best friend, Titinius, down on a horse to see if a group of troops in the distance are friends or enemies.
Cassius's eyesight is poor, so he has his servant Pindarus watch from higher up. Pindarus sees Titinius get surrounded by horsemen. They pull Titinius off his horse, and they are shouting. Pindarus reports to Cassius that Titinius has been captured by the enemy.
Cassius is already operating under immense psychological stress. He's an Epicurean who previously didn't believe in omens, but he just saw eagles abandon their banners and ravens circling his army. He has already primed his brain to expect defeat, so when he hears that his best friend is captured, he doesn't wait for confirmation. He believes the battle is entirely lost. In absolute despair, he orders his servant to stab him with the very same sword he used to kill Caesar.
But the devastating tragedy is that Pindarus misread the data. Titinius wasn't captured by the enemy. He was surrounded by friendly troops who had just won a victory, and they were pulling him off his horse to celebrate and put a wreath of victory on his head.
Cassius kills himself based on completely misinterpreted information. It is a fatal case of confirmation bias. Because he expected to lose, his brain interpreted a neutral or even positive data point, a group of men surrounding a horse, as the worst-case scenario.
The practical question for the listener is, how often do you make permanent or at least highly destructive decisions based on incomplete or misinterpreted information in high-stress environments?
You get a slightly ambiguous email from your boss on a Friday afternoon, or your partner sends a text with a weird tone. And because you are already stressed, you instantly catastrophize. You read the absolute worst-case scenario into the data, you draft a furious resignation letter, or you start a massive fight.
Cassius acted on panic rather than pausing to verify the facts. In our modern, high-speed, anxiety-inducing information environment, the discipline to pause, regulate your nervous system, and wait for clarity before acting drastically is a vital survival skill.
It is the ultimate warning against cognitive bias. And as we zoom out to look at the comparative insight, the universal cycle of power at play here, we see the ultimate tragedy of the entire narrative. Because Brutus and Cassius try to force political change through destruction, they assassinate Caesar to save the Republic. But what actually happens?
Before the final battle, Brutus is sitting in his tent late at night, trying to read, when the ghost of Julius Caesar enters. The ghost identifies itself, saying, "Thy evil spirit, Brutus."
It is the literal manifestation of his guilt, but it's also a profound philosophical realization. Brutus realizes that you can murder a man's physical body, but you cannot kill a spirit, an idea, or a cultural momentum with a sword.
By the end of the text, Cassius and Brutus are both dead by their own hands. But the power vacuum they created by killing Caesar didn't magically restore the democratic norms of the Republic. It simply accelerated its collapse. A new power structure has taken over the triumvirate of Mark Antony, Octavius Caesar, and Lepidus.
And this new regime is terrifying. They are arguably colder and far more ruthless than Julius Caesar ever was. There is a chilling scene where the three of them are sitting around a table, casually marking off lists of senators to be executed. They are literally trading the lives of their own family members for political leverage. Antony casually agrees to have his own nephew killed if Lepidus agrees to kill his brother.
It is the ultimate manifestation of the phrase, "meet the new boss, same as the old boss." The conspirators killed Caesar to stop a tyrant, and instead they paved a superhighway for an even more systemic, entrenched tyranny. Octavius Caesar will eventually become Augustus, the first true Roman emperor.
At the very end, Antony stands over Brutus's dead body and calls him the noblest Roman of them all. He acknowledges that Brutus was the only conspirator who acted for the common good rather than envy. But it is such a hollow victory. Brutus kept his intentions pure, but he lost absolutely everything: his wife, his friends, his own life, and the very republic he tried to save.
If we connect this to broader human concerns found in other wisdom traditions, we see echoes of the Eastern philosophical concept regarding the cyclical nature of empires, something akin to the mandate of heaven. There is a universal truth demonstrated here. Violent revolutions that seek to redress grievances through destruction often merely replace one tyrant with another.
Because the underlying culture hasn't changed. You can assassinate the guy sitting in the chair, but if the foundational system, the economic incentives, and the hearts of the people are broken, the chair will just corrupt the next guy who sits in it.
Exactly. You cannot assassinate your way to a healthy society. The violent removal of a problem without a coherent, pragmatic plan for building a better foundation simply creates a chaotic void. And that void is almost always filled by whoever is the most ruthless, not whoever is the most noble.
This has been an absolutely incredible journey through a text that is just dense with psychology, political theory, and stark warnings. As we wrap up this deep dive into the muddy waters of human ambition, I want to leave you, the listener, with one final provocative thought to mull over.
Throughout the text, as we discussed, the characters are constantly looking at the weather and the heavens. They see violent storms, ravens, comets, and raining fire, and they interpret these natural phenomena as mirroring their human chaos.
Obviously, in the 21st century, we may not believe that comets predict the death of princes, or that lightning storms are the gods expressing anger at our political elections. But here's the question for you. How much does your internal emotional weather project onto the reality you see around you?
It is a profound reflection on the psychology of projection.
When you are deeply anxious, when you feel out of control, or when you're carrying hidden guilt like Brutus, doesn't the whole world suddenly look hostile? Don't neutral comments from coworkers suddenly seem like conspiracies? Are we, like Cassius and Brutus and Calpurnia, simply reading our own anxieties into the skies? Do we see disaster and betrayal everywhere around us simply because we are carrying disaster and betrayal inside us?
That is a lot to think about.
That's the heart of this section. This is Wisdom for the Present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.